England still couldn't believe what had happened at the Royal Spring Ball. For 12 years, Duke Edmund Blackwood had refused every lady presented to him. Then, before the eyes of England's highest society, he finally asked one woman for the first dance. Lady Clara Ashbourne refused him. Instead of walking away, the Duke followed her to Ashbourne Hall the following day. There, Clara asked the question England had been asking for 12 long years. Why? Edmund looked across the flooded fields and quietly answered, because 12 years ago, I made a promise. But before he could explain, he simply smiled and said, when the time is right, I'll tell you everything. That should have been the end of their conversation. Instead, it became the beginning of a story neither of them expected. Before we discover how one 12-year-old promise was about to face its greatest test, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Candlelit Vows, and tell me in the comments. Do you believe every promise should be kept, even if it costs you the person you love? Clara stood quietly beside the repaired bridge, watching the river rush beneath the newly reinforced supports. The workers had returned to their duties, leaving only the two of them, surrounded by the gentle sounds of hammering in the distance and birds settling into the nearby trees. She looked at Edmund carefully. Then how will I know when the time is right? She asked. Edmund remained silent for several moments before answering, when you know enough about the man to understand the promise. Clara searched his face. You're asking me to trust something you refuse to explain. No, he answered gently. I'm asking you not to judge it before you understand it. She lowered her eyes briefly before smiling. You make patience sound much easier than it is. A faint smile appeared on Edmund's face. I assure you, it isn't. For the first time since meeting him, Clara realized the sadness she had noticed wasn't simply hidden behind his eyes. It lived there. Whatever promise he had made 12 years ago had not only changed his future, it had become the prison in which he quietly lived every day. Before she could ask another question, the sound of carriage wheels echoed across the gravel road leading toward Ashbourne Hall. Both of them turned instinctively. A polished black carriage bearing the Ashcombe family crest rolled to a gentle stop near the entrance to the estate. The footman quickly stepped down and opened the carriage door. A tall gentleman in his early 30s emerged, wearing a navy Victorian riding coat over a cream waistcoat, polished riding boots, and neatly fitted gloves. He carried himself with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to country estates, rather than London's ballrooms. The moment he noticed Clara, a warm smile crossed his face. Lady Clara. Clara's expression brightened politely. Lord Henry. Henry removed his hat before approaching. Only then did he notice Edmund standing nearby. His posture immediately became more formal. Your Grace. Edmund returned the respectful nod. Lord Henry Ashcombe. Henry smiled pleasantly. I wasn't aware Blackwood had taken an interest in Ashbourne, Edmund answered calmly. Neither was I. Clara couldn't help laughing softly. Henry looked between them, amused by a joke he clearly hadn't heard. I hope I haven't interrupted anything important. Only a conversation, Clara replied. Then perhaps my timing is fortunate. He glanced toward the damaged estate road. I received word about the flooding. Father suggested I stop by to see whether Ashbourne needed additional wagons or workers. Clara smiled appreciatively. That was thoughtful of him. Henry looked toward the bridge. It appears you've already made excellent progress. Edmund quietly observed the ease with which Clara spoke to Henry. There was no awkwardness, no ceremony, only the relaxed familiarity of two people who had known one another for many years. After a brief silence, Edmund looked toward Clara. May I ask you something? Of course. He glanced politely toward Henry before looking back at her. Lord Henry. He hesitated only briefly. Is he important to you? Clara looked surprised by the question before smiling gently. Our families were neighbours for years. She looked toward Henry, who had already begun speaking with several estate workers about transporting timber. We've known each other since we were children. Edmund nodded thoughtfully. I see. Clara continued quietly, almost without thinking. He's a good man. Edmund followed her gaze toward Henry for a moment before looking back at her. I'm glad to hear it. There was not the slightest hint of jealousy in his voice, only quiet reflection. He reached for his gloves. I should leave you to your work. Clara blinked. You're leaving already? Edmund smiled politely. I promised myself I wouldn't become another interruption in your day. She found herself unexpectedly disappointed. Will I see you again? The question escaped before she realized she had spoken it aloud. For the first time, Edmund seemed genuinely surprised. Then his expression softened. I hope so. He bowed respectfully to her before inclining his head toward Henry. Lord Henry, Your Grace. Moments later, the Blackwood carriage disappeared slowly down the long country road. Clara remained standing exactly where she was, watching it until it vanished beyond the trees. Henry eventually walked back toward her, carrying several survey maps beneath one arm. He followed her gaze toward the empty road before smiling curiously. Interesting gentleman. Clara looked at him. Very. Henry chuckled. I've known many dukes. He folded the maps. I've never met one who spent the morning helping rebuild a bridge. Clara smiled quietly. Neither have I. Several miles away, Edmund sat alone inside his carriage as the countryside drifted past the windows. He hadn't spoken since leaving Ashbourne Hall. The rhythmic sound of the horses' hooves echoed through the silence. His coachman eventually called through the small window, separating them. Straight home to Blackwood Manor, Your Grace? Edmund answered almost automatically. Yes. Silence returned. Outside, fields stretched endlessly beneath the afternoon sun. Yet Edmund wasn't seeing any of them. He heard Clara's voice instead. We've known each other since we were children. A few moments later, another sentence quietly returned to him. He's a good man. Edmund slowly closed his eyes. For 12 years, he had never once cared whether another gentleman admired a woman he had refused. It had never mattered. Today, for the first time, it did. Not because he feared losing Lady Clara Ashbourne, but because, for the first time in 12 years, he realized life might not wait forever while he hid behind a promise. For the first time in 12 years, Duke Edmund Blackwood found himself questioning something he had never questioned before. Timing. The carriage rolled steadily along the country road toward Blackwood Manor, but Edmund barely noticed the passing fields beyond the window. His thoughts remained at Ashbourne Hall. He could still hear Clara's voice. We've known each other since we were children. Then another sentence quietly returned. He's a good man. Edmund leaned back against the carriage seat and closed his eyes. Henry Ashcombe had done nothing wrong. He had been respectful, honest, helpful, the sort of gentleman any father would gladly welcome into his family. Exactly the sort of gentleman Clara deserved, yet for reasons he could not explain. The realization unsettled him. The coachman finally broke the silence. We'll reach the manor within the hour, Your Grace, Edmund answered absent-mindedly. Very good. But his thoughts refused to leave Ashbourne Hall. For 12 years, he had walked away from introductions without looking back. Today, for the first time, he found himself wondering what might happen if someone else kept walking toward the woman he had only just begun to know. Blackwood Manor appeared beyond the iron gates just before sunset. Mrs. Collins welcomed him inside with her usual smile, though it faded almost immediately. "You've brought half the countryside home with you, Your Grace." Edmund looked down at the dried mud covering his boots and the dust clinging to his coat. A faint smile crossed his face. "It appears I have." Eleanor Blackwood was waiting in the drawing room. She looked up the moment her son entered. "You're later than I expected." Edmund removed his gloves. The bridge needed more work than anticipated. Eleanor noticed the mud on his sleeves before noticing something else. He looked lighter, not happier exactly, but alive in a way she had not seen for years. "Did your visit answer any questions?" she asked carefully. Edmund remained silent for several moments. "No." Eleanor's expression softened. "Did it create new ones?" This time he smiled. "Several." She waited, hoping he might continue. Instead, he quietly excused himself and disappeared toward the library. Mrs. Collins looked after him before whispering, "He smiled twice." Eleanor nodded. "I counted." "Do you think he's finally?" Eleanor gently interrupted her. "Hope has disappointed this house too many times." She looked toward the closed library door. "But today—" A small smile appeared despite herself. Today it knocked again. Meanwhile, Ashbourne Hall settled into its usual evening routine. Clara sat inside her father's old study reviewing estate accounts while rain tapped gently against the windows. Yet the columns of numbers refused to hold her attention. Instead, she found herself remembering Edmund's face when she had mentioned Henry. Not jealousy. Certainly not. Something quieter. Something closer to regret. She sighed softly before closing the ledger. "You're distracted." Clara looked up to find her long-time housekeeper, Mrs. Edith Harper, standing in the doorway carrying fresh tea. Clara smiled faintly. "Am I that obvious?" "Only to someone who's watched you since you were 6. Edith placed the tray upon the desk. "Does this distraction happen to have dark hair and the title Duke?" Clara laughed, despite herself. "You listen far too carefully to the servants." Edith smiled knowingly. "The servants aren't talking about the Duke." Clara looked surprised. "No?" Edith shook her head. "They're talking about the gentleman who spent an entire morning carrying timber without once mentioning he owned half the county." Clara lowered her eyes toward her untouched ledger. "He's not at all what people say." "Sometimes," Edith replied gently, "people only see the title standing in front of the person." Before Clara could answer, the butler entered, carrying a silver tray. Resting upon it was a cream-coloured envelope sealed with dark green wax. "A letter for you, my lady." Clara broke the seal. Her expression immediately changed. Edith noticed. "Bad news?" Clara slowly lowered the letter. "No." She looked almost confused. "An invitation." "From whom?" Clara turned the envelope over. Embossed upon the back was the royal crest. "Buckingham Palace." Edith's eyebrows lifted. Clara unfolded the letter once more and read silently. Then she read it again. Finally, she whispered almost to herself, "The King is hosting a charity council next Thursday." Edith smiled. "That sounds important." Clara nodded slowly. "It is." Another pause followed. "Every major estate in England has been invited." Edith poured the tea. "Then Ashbourne should be proud." Clara's eyes remained fixed on the letter. "There's one sentence here I don't understand." "Which one?" Clara quietly read it aloud. "His Grace Duke Edmund Blackwood has personally recommended Ashbourne Estate for recognition of its charitable work." The room fell silent. Edith looked at her in surprise. Clara stared at the letter as though it belonged to someone else. Edmund had never mentioned recommending her estate. He had sought no credit, told no one, simply done it quietly. Hundreds of miles away, Edmund sat alone inside his library, opening the same leather-bound journal he had kept locked away for 12 years. He dipped his pen into the ink before writing only a single sentence. "Today, I met a woman whose respect matters more than my reputation." He stared at the words for a long time before gently closing the journal. Outside the library window, darkness settled over Blackwood Manor. Inside Ashbourne Hall, Clara carefully folded the King's invitation and placed it beside the lamp on her desk. Neither of them knew that before the week came to an end, England would begin believing there was only one future Duchess of Blackwood. And that dangerous rumour was about to place Lady Clara Ashbourne in more danger than either of them could imagine. The King's Charity Council ended beneath warm applause, yet Lady Clara Ashbourne barely heard any of it. One sentence echoed louder than every voice inside Buckingham Palace. Ashbourne Estate first came to the attention of the Crown through a recommendation submitted 6 months ago by His Grace, Duke Edmund Blackwood. 6 months. Long before the royal spring ball, long before he had asked her for the first dance, long before they had ever spoken a single word. Clara quietly excused herself from the reception and stepped into the palace gardens, hoping the cool afternoon breeze might calm her thoughts. It only made them louder. Why had he admired her work before he even knew her? Why had he never told her? More importantly, what promise could keep a man from every woman in England for 12 years? Gravel crunched softly behind her. She didn't turn. Somehow, she already knew who it was. "You followed me," she said quietly. Edmund stopped a respectful distance away. "I wanted to be certain you were all right." Clara slowly faced him. "I'm not." Edmund remained silent. She stepped closer, holding his gaze. "You promised me that when the time was right, you would tell me the truth." He looked toward the palace gardens where roses climbed ancient stone walls. After several moments, he nodded. "The time is right." Together they walked toward a quiet stone bench overlooking the fountain. Neither hurried, neither spoke. It felt as though both of them understood that whatever came next would change everything. Edmund rested both hands upon his walking cane before finally speaking. "The answer didn't begin with me." Clara waited quietly. "It began with my grandmother." A faint smile appeared across his face. Lady Beatrice Blackwood was loved by everyone in England. He looked toward the fountain. Everyone except the man whose love she wanted most. Clara listened without interrupting. "My grandfather was an honourable duke. He protected her, respected her, gave her every comfort money could buy." His voice softened. "Everything, except his heart." Clara felt her own chest tighten. Edmund continued, "As a little boy, I thought they had a happy marriage. They smiled at dinners, hosted grand balls, received guests together." He looked down at his hands. "Then one stormy night, I couldn't sleep." His voice became quieter. "I wandered downstairs and found my grandmother sitting alone in the music room." He smiled sadly. "There wasn't any music," Clara whispered gently. "What was she doing?" Edmund's eyes grew distant. "Waiting." A long silence followed. "Waiting for someone who wasn't coming." Clara said nothing. She noticed me standing in the doorway and smiled as though nothing was wrong. He laughed softly to himself. She always protected everyone else's heart, even when hers was breaking. Another pause. I asked her why she was sitting there in the dark. His voice almost disappeared. She looked at the empty chair beside her and said. He swallowed slowly before repeating the words that had lived inside him for 12 years. "Edmund." There is no lonelier place in this world than beside someone who never truly chooses you. Clara closed her eyes. Tears began forming before she realized it. Edmund continued. Several months later, she became gravely ill. He looked toward the sky. Everyone believed she wanted to speak to my father. Another pause. Instead, she asked for me. His voice trembled for the first time. Edmund, promise me something. Clara leaned forward slightly. If one day you marry, never ask a woman to spend her life wondering why she wasn't enough. Tears rolled freely down Clara's face. Edmund continued, if you cannot love her completely, let her find the man who will. His own eyes filled with tears. I promised her. He smiled faintly through the sadness. She kissed my forehead. Another silence. She died peacefully before sunrise. Clara reached for his hand without thinking. This time she didn't stop herself. Edmund looked down at her hand, resting gently upon his. For years, I believed that promise belonged only to my grandmother. He sighed quietly. Then I grew older. Clara looked at him. And you saw your parents? Edmund nodded slowly. My father wasn't cruel. No. He wasn't unfaithful. No. He was a respected duke, a good father. His voice grew heavy. But somewhere along the way, duty became stronger than love. Clara listened, with her heart breaking. My mother never complained. He smiled sadly. She still doesn't. Another pause. But there were nights when I would pass the music room. His eyes drifted into memory, and find her sitting in the very same chair my grandmother once occupied. Clara covered her mouth. Edmund looked toward the palace gardens. That was the moment I understood. His voice barely rose above a whisper. Grandmother wasn't warning me about her marriage. He looked back at Clara. She was warning me about my family's future. Silence surrounded them. Even the fountain seemed to stop. I couldn't become another Blackwood husband who offered respect without love. His eyes glistened. So every time a young woman was introduced to me, he smiled sadly. I asked myself one question. Clara whispered, What question? Can I promise her my whole heart? He slowly shook his head. If the answer was no, I refused her, before she spent a lifetime waiting for something I could never give. Clara's tears fell freely now. England believed you were rejecting those women because they weren't enough. Edmund looked at her with quiet pain. The truth was, I didn't believe I was enough for them. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Clara broke the silence. Edmund. He looked toward her. For 12 years, you've been protecting women who never even knew they needed protecting. He smiled gently. I thought that was what my promise required. Clara slowly shook her head. No. He frowned slightly. She squeezed his hand. Your promise was never to refuse love. Another pause. It was to refuse a loveless marriage. Edmund stared at her. She continued softly. You've spent 12 years making sure you never became your grandfather. Tears filled his eyes again. Or my father. Clara nodded. But somewhere along the way, she smiled through her tears. You forgot that your grandmother never asked you to stop living. Edmund lowered his head. It was as though 12 years of loneliness suddenly became visible all at once. I never thought of it that way. Clara smiled gently. I know. The journey back to Blackwood Manor passed almost entirely in silence. That evening, Edmund found his mother in the music room. She looked up in surprise. Edmund. He slowly entered and closed the door behind him. Eleanor noticed something immediately. He looked lighter and somehow younger. Mother, she smiled warmly. What is it? He looked around the familiar room before quietly saying, I finally understand why grandmother loved this room so much. Eleanor's smile faded. "What do you mean?" Edmund sat beside her. For the first time in 12 years, he told her everything. He spoke about Lady Beatrice, about the promise, about the lonely nights, about watching her father unknowingly repeat the same marriage. Eleanor never interrupted. By the time he finished, tears covered her cheeks. She reached for his face exactly as she had when he was a little boy. "Oh, Edmund," she whispered, "you carried all of that. Alone?" He nodded quietly. Eleanor smiled through her tears. "Your grandmother asked too much of a little boy." Edmund shook his head. "No." His voice was calm now, peaceful. "She asked exactly enough." Eleanor looked at him lovingly. "Then let me ask you something." He waited. "Do you love Lady Clara Ashbourne?" For the first time since becoming Duke, Edmund answered without hesitation, "With my whole heart." Eleanor laughed softly through her tears. "Then your promise has already been fulfilled." He looked at her in surprise. She smiled. "Your grandmother never asked you to refuse the woman you loved." Another pause. "She asked you never to marry without love." Edmund slowly smiled. The weight he had carried for 12 years finally lifted. The following afternoon he returned to Ashbourne Hall. Clara was standing in the rose garden when she saw him approaching. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Edmund stopped before her. "Lady Clara." She smiled knowingly. "Yes." He smiled back. "May I have that first dance?" Clara looked around the quiet garden before laughing softly. "There's no orchestra." Edmund gently offered his hand. "There never needed to be." She placed her hand in his. Beneath the golden evening sun, surrounded only by roses and birdsong, they danced slowly across the garden paths. No audience,